Welcome to part 3. So, organizing your edit project might feel like a slow way to start what could be an exciting edit. I'm telling you that it's something that you don't want to gloss over. The extra time you spend up front will pay you back twofold while you're actually inside the edit. With an organized project, you're going to be faster because you will have already referenced all of the media in the project at least one time, if not more. And because all of the media will have been sorted by the time you start editing, it's going to be in easy to find locations. So the first thing I want to talk about is naming conventions. You're obviously going to need to name your project, and the more detailed you are here, the better. Much like folder structures, it's good to have a standardized naming convention that you regularly use. And if you're working in a team environment, it's important that everyone follows that same convention. Otherwise, it's going to be like the Wild West. So at a glance, a good project name is going to tell you the client, the project name, and when the file was last edited. And if needed, who did the last edit on that project file. Here's a quick example. Name tag underscore Dilla's promo underscore 200826. Now, you're looking at this and you might be thinking, why do we put the year first? Well, I'll agree that it looks strange, but that's just because it's not what you're used to. When you have a project that crosses over years, like starting in December and delivering in February, then adding a date with the year first keeps the files in numerical order when they're listed inside of Finder or Explorer. You might also be wondering, what's the point of constantly renaming this file? Well, it's not just renaming, it's duplicating and renaming. Let me show you real quick. So in front of us, we have two windows. I have this window that is pointing to my local project folder on my local hard drive. And in this window, I have my media array where all of my media goes, and it's where I'm gonna back up my projects at the end of the day. So at the beginning of the day, when I start a project, in my project folder on my local hard drive, I will take the project file and I will Control-C and Control-V to copy that. On Mac, you could just hit Command-D to duplicate. I'll move the old project into the Z-Old folder, and then I will rename the newly duplicated project with today's date, so 10/28. Great. Then I'll go in and edit my project. When I'm done editing at the end of the day, I'll come back to this folder, copy this project, come over to my media RAID and paste it into this folder. And now I have a backup of that project that I've worked on all day long. From there, I'll move this project, the 925 project, into the Z-Old folder. And now I see my latest project that I've worked on right here in my media project. Now, you're probably wondering, what's with all the duplicating? Why do we do that? Well, the point is because after you start working on a project, you'll build up an archive of projects. So every one of these projects, I have all of the edits that I've done on that day backed up. So if I get too far in, say, this project and realize, oh my gosh, I deleted something that I wasn't supposed to within the Premiere project, I'm able to go back through these projects and find what I deleted, pull it into my most recent project, and there's no harm, no foul. We're good to go. By backing up these files, it creates a really large archive that doesn't take up a lot of hard drive space, but can cover your butt in case something happens where you accidentally delete something, if a project becomes corrupted, or if, heaven forbid, a drive crashes. This is a good way to make sure that you're safe, because not only are you duplicating and creating an archive here, you also have that same archive in the Z-Old folder on your local drive. Moving on from the name, let's look at the actual project. Now, remember what we discussed in part 1? You should edit your project files on their own dedicated drive. At the end of the day, you can back them up to the media project folder. Now, when working in a remote environment, you can operate in one of two ways. You can keep the project files backed up on the server and copy them locally when editing, and then move them back to the server when you're finished. Or with a fast enough connection, you can work on a separate partition on the server that is dedicated to just the project files. Let's move on to the project's render settings. With a blank project in front of you, go ahead and open File, Project Settings, General. You'll be presented with a screen where you can look at the render settings. In short, the renderer that you use is how Premiere creates the video that you see on the screen. So for faster rendering, you should always use the GPU renderer that relies on your graphics cards. Now, there are going to be times, for one reason or another, when Premiere Pro is going to be cranky and it's going to do weird, glitchy things in the program monitor while you're editing. And yes, that is the professional description, weird, glitchy things. Anyways, when that might and probably will occur, one troubleshooting step is to change your renderer to software only, which is going to use your computer's processor and not the graphics card. Rendering with software only is going to be slower, but it's more foolproof and allows you to troubleshoot what might be going on inside of your edit. Now, if you click over onto the Scratch Disk tab, we can choose where we want Premiere's working files to live. There are cases where you might want to separate these, but personally, I find it's easiest to point them all to the same Scratch folder location on a dedicated fast hard drive like we discussed in part 1. I do the same for Premiere's Media Cache, which is found under Edit, Preferences, Media Cache. So with Premiere Pro open, go ahead and hit New Project, and then in here, we're just going to call this Scramble King _ today's date. So that's going to be 20/10/28. Great. Okay, and then let's put this in our project folder. Good to go. Okay, from here we're going to look at the renderer. By default, this is going to start out on our CUDA GPU accelerated renderer, which is what we want. So let's leave that alone. Now, the rest of these we can leave as they are. Looks good to me. And on Scratch Disk, I'm going to change this to my render Scratch drive. So under Z, I'm going to point it to Scratch and just hit Enter to say select folder. And now I'm going to quickly go through all of these by hitting Browse and then Enter, because it's going to default to that Scratch folder that I just pointed it to. Okay, and from there we're good to go. So let's say OK. Okay, now we have a blank project. So from here, what we need to do is go to Edit, Preferences, let's jump over to Media Cache. And now the Media Cache, whenever this window pops up, stays the same no matter what project you're in. The project settings change from project to project. So as you can see, these have already been set to my Scratch disk. So you can click Browse, send that to where they need to go, and say OK. So that's it for settings. Let's move on to the bin structure. Like the folder structure we discussed in part 2, it's helpful to have a uniform bin structure for at least a starting point in projects. And it's often necessary due to the specifics of a project to build out the bin structure to suit an individual project's needs, or even an individual editor's needs or preferences. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but my preferred bin structure closely resembles my project's folder structure in Finder or Explorer. I have separate bins for sequences, audio, footage, and graphics, and the plus in front of sequences keeps that bin sorted to the top of the project window whenever I sort by name. And within those main bins, I can drill down into more specific bins for holding different types of media. Let's go take a look at how to build this from scratch. I have my hotkey for a new bin set to Control B. Now, you could also get to that by going New Bin, and it's going to make a new bin. But what's faster than that is hitting Control B. Or if you're on a Mac, you could hit Command B. You can really set it to whatever you want. Now, over here, we'll add a plus, and we'll do sequences. Let's do a new bin. When you have a bin selected and you hit New Bin with that bin selected, it's going to make the new bin inside of the previous bin. That's okay. Don't worry about that. We'll make another bin and call it Audio. Move that out here. Make a new bin. We'll say Footage. Make a new bin and call this Graphics. Inside the audio bin, go ahead and make another bin. We'll make this Music. We'll do another bin for VO. And how about another one for sound effects? Oh, and let's do one more for source. Okay, so we can twirl that up. Under sequences, I'm going to add another bin for X working. This is where I'll keep all of my working sequences, things like string outs, which we'll discuss later. Any kind of interviews or nested sequences, I always put into my working bin so I can get it out of the way if I don't need to look at it. So we'll do that. And then I'll do another bin and we'll say Z old, which much like the file structure that we used in Finder or in Explorer, I will dump my old sequences into rather than just deleting them. That way I always have a backup of my sequences that I can fall back on if I need to. And so that looks good to me. Now, something I like to do is I also like to go into my project and create an adjustment layer that I could possibly use when I need to. So all right, so it'll pop up with 1920 by 1080. That looks good. I know I'm working in an HD project. We'll say OK. And I'll just drop that into my graphics folder just so I have it because I know I'm probably going to need it. The next thing we'll want to do is look at starting a sequence. Now, sequence settings, this box can be pretty scary to look at. It's big, it's scary, and you might not be fond of it if you're just making a new sequence from clips. It's important that you get familiar with these settings, not only because it helps you troubleshoot issues in an edit, but when you deliver projects to clients, this is the starting point for determining delivery specifications. I'm going to discuss more about those later in the course. For now, I want to discuss how to make custom sequence presets. So with our sequences been selected, there's a couple of ways that we can make a new sequence. We can hit Control N, which would start a new sequence, or we can go to File, New, and then down to Sequence. Okay, this box pops up, and you'll see under the available presets that there are a lot of options that you can choose from. Tons of stuff in here. Well, I'm going to go ahead and skip through all of these because normally I rely on these custom presets that I made. I'll show you how to do that in a minute. But before we even get to this, let's talk about the sequence settings themselves. So in here, you'll see that this box is a little big, maybe a little scary, and it's broken up into a few sections, and we're going to go through those one by one. The first thing I want to look at is the editing mode. Now, the editing mode, if you click on that, again pops up with a ton of different options. Now, from in here, you can forget about 99% of these for any HD or high resolution project that you're going to work on. The ones that I want you to remember are DNX HD and DNX HR. So if I'm working on a DNX HD project, I can hit DNX 1080p, and it's going to set all of these settings for me exactly the way that I want them. Now, if you don't want to use the Avid codec, and I personally prefer to use ProRes, and I don't have a good reason why, it's just my preference. To do that, up until recently, there was a distinct absence of a ProRes editing mode in this list, but recently Adobe added ProRes RAW. You can select this, and from the RAW settings, it's going to go ahead and set a default 1920 by 1080. You can increase or decrease this if you want to. You can change the time base. It's going to default to 23976. And it's going to set your preview file format to QuickTime and your codec to Apple ProRes 422. Now, this is great, but I want to also show you how to get your hands dirty and make these settings for yourself. So jump back into the editing mode, and let's change this to custom. Now, with custom selected, you can pick your time base, and you can choose 23976 or 2398. It rounds up. And if you need a different time base, simply select this and then grab whatever time base you need, like 2997. We're going to stick with 23976 though. Okay, from there you can adjust your frame size. If I wanted to make this bigger or smaller, I can. Now, it is worth noting that these two sizes are not relative to each other. So I just changed the horizontal dimension, and it did not change the vertical dimension on its own. So you'll need to do that yourself. Okay, now let's go ahead and change that back to 1920 by 1080. Okay, that brings us down to our pixel aspect ratio. If we're working with HD footage or anything above HD, high resolution footage, this will always be square pixels. You should never change this. If you start working with standard definition footage in a project, then you might need to dive into your pixel aspect ratio a little bit further. If you're doing standard definition video, you'll want to look at these D1/DV NTSC options. You can stay away from PAL unless you're in a PAL country. You'll want to stick with NTSC or NTSC widescreen if you're working with widescreen material. Below that, we have fields. Now again, since we're working with modern footage that's high definition or high resolution, most likely our footage is going to be progressive scan. So we're not going to need to worry about upper or lower fields. We'll talk about fields a little bit later in the course, but just so you know, if you're working in standard definition footage, you'll want to choose lower field. And if you happen to be working with interlaced footage that is high definition, so 1920 by 1080 at 2997 frames a second, you'll want to choose upper field. Always remember, upper goes to high definition and lower goes to standard definition. But like I said, since we're working with modern footage, it's going to be progressive, and it's really only important to know that this option is here if you're having to deliver something with interlaced fields. Now below that, we have the display format, and the display format is different from the time base. So our editing time base can still be 23976, but let's say we're working on a TV show or a movie and we need to make sure that our timing is spot on to what a network is telling us in their specifications. Well, in order to do that, we can change our display format to 2997. That'll change our time code and our timelines to read out at 2997 rather than the 23976 that we're cutting in. Pretty handy, but let's leave that there. Below that is the color working space. Now, the color working space up until recently didn't exist in Premiere. We didn't have the option to change it. But with the proliferation of HDR media, now we have the option of changing this to a Rec 2100 HLG. Since we're just working with regular HD footage, we can leave this at Rec 709. For the audio, we can leave this alone. 4800 is good as well. 48,000 is good, as well as the audio samples. Most editors prefer to work with audio samples rather than the milliseconds. If you prefer milliseconds, please feel free to change that. And now to what I would consider the most important box in this entire screen. The video previews are the actual videos that Premiere is showing you in the program monitor. Now, if you're working with a lot of H.264 media and maybe you just drop some media into a sequence, there's a good chance that this preview file format is going to be this iframe only MPEG. Now, it was a good attempt by Adobe, but in the long run, it just doesn't really work out. I can almost promise you that if you're having issues while you're editing and you're seeing glitches or just weird things happening in the program monitor, or maybe there's even stuff that appears like artifacts you see in your exports after you export a video out of Premiere, those things are happening because of your video previews. I can almost guarantee it. So as a first troubleshooting step, anytime Premiere starts acting weird, doing things that you don't expect, double check that your sequence settings are correct and that your video previews are set to a good intra-frame codec like Apple ProRes 422. To do that, just hit your file format, go down, find QuickTime, go to your codec, and then choose one of these flavors of ProRes. And I'm going to leave that at 422. Now, the last thing that you'll see here are our width and our heights. Now, this is different. The video preview width and height are different from the frame size in that this is just what the previews look like. If you set this to something, let's say we do 960 by 540, this resolution is locked, okay? So it's going to show a smaller file preview over here in our program window, but when we export, it's still going to export same as source with this 1920 by 1080. So that's really nice if you are working on a laptop or just a desktop that doesn't have a lot of horsepower. This is effectively lowering the resolution that Premiere is having to calculate. So that's a good trick to keep in your back pocket if you need to. Okay, now I want to take a look at our tracks. One of the weird quirks with Premiere Pro is that we cannot add or remove tracks after we create a sequence. So if you have a sequence that you need to make that has a specific audio configuration, you need to make sure that those settings are set before you start adding media to that sequence, or you'll have to copy all of your media into a new sequence with the proper audio configuration. And what I mean by that is, let's say that we're sending out a video and it has 5.1 surround sound. Well, 5.1 surround sound needs 6 tracks of audio. So we can add 2 tracks of audio, and then we can actually assign those tracks inside the timeline for where that audio feeds into. This is also a good screen if you want to change the number of tracks that your video timeline starts with. By default, it comes with 3, but if you want to make that 4 tracks or 10 tracks, whatever you want, you can do that right here and it'll start this sequence with that many tracks. So before moving on, I want to show you how to save this as a preset. And you might be saying, well, we click that Save Preset button, and you're right. So we click that, we can name the preset, and let's just call this ProRes 1080p. You can give it a name, ProRes 1080p, and even if you want to, you can add a description to help you remember what's going on with this specific preset. Hit OK, and it'll be saved under your sequence preset menu right here. Now, the last thing we have to do is decide on a name. And if you remember anything from when we discussed file names, there is more to a sequence name than meets the eye. Now we need to talk more naming conventions. All right. I know you're as excited as I am, but here we go anyways. Naming sequences is similar to naming a project, and all the useful information should be right there in the sequence name at a glance. What you also want to include is a version number for the sequence that you're on. Version numbers help keep track of your edits between editing and client revisions, and you can version by number, by letter, or even a combination of the two. Again, what's most important is that you're consistent with the convention you're using, and if you're working on a team, that everyone is on the same versioning scheme. Okay, we're done. The project is made, but now time for a life hack. So you can tell that even when you're moving quickly, setting up a project from scratch takes a little bit of time. Well, if your projects all use the same structure and generally the same settings, it's best to make that blank project into a template. So from here, I'm going to save this to my desktop and I'm going to call it blank template. So now on my desktop, I have a blank template that whenever I start a Premiere project, I can double click, it'll open, and then I can Control Shift Save As, put this into my project file. as the project that I want to start working on. And because I saved the template file with all of my project settings, everything that I set before is ready to go. You can take this a step further by putting in things like sound effects and graphics, stuff that you use in all of your projects, and you can make this template into a virtual toolkit for yourself when you're starting a project. It can save you a ton of time if you plan it out. Okay, let's pull some media into Premiere. You can obviously drag and drop, you can use the media browser, you can even right-click and import. It doesn't really matter, except when you're pulling in R3D files. Some file types, like red footage, are segmented as they're recorded. So simply dragging and dropping these files into Premiere will pull in all of the individual segments without their raw settings. Not exactly what you want. Instead, always import red files through the media browser so that the full file comes into your project intact with the raw settings attached. Once the media is into the project, you can then start sorting into bins based on the project's needs. That could be by shoot day, by scenes and takes, by interview names, by camera angles, by locations, anything you can think of. The options are really endless. What's important is that you do something that makes sense. Here we are back at our project that we previously set up. Now, what I'm going to do is we want to look at importing our footage. So let's open up a Finder window or Explorer window, and here we are at our footage. Now, the nice thing about Premiere is I can literally select all of these things. I'm not going to grab graphics because I don't need it right now, and I can drag them into the footage bin inside my project. Jump back over here. It's importing the files. It'll pop up and let me know if there's any errors that happen. We can look at these and see that these DS store files, or things that are created by a Mac computer, have no effect on our project, so we don't need to worry about it. Say okay. Twirl open the footage and everything is already in here, ready to go. So that's one way of importing our footage. The other way, so let's go ahead and remove this, is we can go through the media browser. And inside the media browser, I can navigate to that same folder on my hard drive and grab either a full folder and drag it into the bin, or I can double click and grab individual clips. Now I'm gonna go ahead and grab all of these and pull them back in. Good to go, get the same error message, no worries. Okay, so we've got that. Now, I do want to point out again that if you're working with red footage, .r3d footage, it is important that you import it using the media browser. If you import red footage into Premiere Pro by dragging and dropping it from a Finder window or an Explorer window, or if you right-click and import it, segmented R3D clips are not going to work correctly inside of Premiere. So make sure when you're working with red footage, you always go through the media browser. Okay, enough of that high horse. Feel free to grab some flannel because it's time to do some logging. Nothing? Logging is the process of describing in words the content of each clip in a project. It can also include important information like camera angles. Now, logging might feel like a waste of time, but on large projects, it's actually a huge time saver. Imagine that you're knee-deep into an edit on a documentary about the 1970s, and you're looking for specific clips of a water-skiing squirrel wearing a tie-dye t-shirt. Now, you could sift through bins of footage until you find that clip, or you could do a quick keyword search for squirrel and skim the results. Whether or not your project warrants detailed logging is entirely project dependent, and I'm sure you're tired of me saying that it depends on the project, but it's true, because if this is a small project that, again, you can bang out really quickly, it might not make sense to spend a lot of time logging when you could just simply scrub through the footage. But if it's a massive project that has tons of footage and it's going to take months for you to edit, maybe it makes more sense to spend a little time up front combing through the footage, describing everything, and then editing. That way you can move faster on the back end. So what I want to do is I can come to my project window and right-click on the columns in my project window and click Metadata Display. And this window will pop up, and you can see from the get-go that there are a ton of options that we can open up inside of Premiere to help us log this footage. Now, I have two things that I typically use, and outside of that, I don't touch. That's me. You guys can use whatever you think. Now, the ones that I need are description. Whoop. Again, I'm just having a terrible time typing. Our description. So we'll turn that on. And I also want to see the camera angle. And say okay. And what's cool, before I say okay, is I can save these preferences. So if I want to save these settings and make a custom setting, let's just call this basic info. Now I have a preset that I can go to anytime I want to do logging or anything else. And all I have to do is do a quick drop down instead of having to search for it manually in there. All right, say okay, and come back over to our footage. Now let's stretch this window out. We don't really need to see what's going on just yet. I'm gonna wanna see my source monitor, and that's about it. Now, so I'm gonna move my description, click and drag, move it over here. And we can leave the camera angle alone right now. Okay, so looking back at our cinematic clips, let's just open this up. Now, if we twirl this open, we can double click and we can quickly scrub through this and see what's going on. And basically what you want to do is watch what's happening and give some sort of idea of the action. Now, you can tell our DIT on set, when they created these clips, they went through and did a little bit of basic logging for us. Now, I'm not going to go through and log this entire thing in front of you. That would be a terrible thing to watch. I hope you can understand that. But I can go through and show you. We can click on description and say wide, takedown, and slow-mo. And it just gives a little bit of detail of what's going on inside this shot. Now, if we click on the next shot, we can see, oh, this is a close-up. And so we can say close-up, or you could even use the abbreviation CU for close-up, or we could just say close and say handshake, match start. And that's the gist of going through this. The more detailed you are with these logs, the better you're gonna go. So if you're working on a show that has characters, if you're working on multiple interviews, you can include all of that information inside the description. You can include character names, you can include locations, anything that is important to an editor that you would need to be able to search for when you're inside the edit. Now let's set that aside. I wanna close up cinematic shots real quick, and I'm gonna twirl open our interview. And notice we have two folders here, and this is because later on in the course, we're gonna need to work with our dirty footage and our clean footage. I'll explain more of that later. But what I wanna show you right now has to pertain to the camera angle. So you can see that these camera clips have already been labeled for us. We have A, B, and C cams. Now I wanna actually change that on the camera angle column in here. So all I'm gonna do is add A cam. And since we have two, I'm gonna copy that and paste it right here and do the same thing for all of these. So B cam and C cam. Great, we're done with that. So the camera angles are really gonna help us when we start working with multicam clips later on in the course. But aside from that, that's all I really need to show you on the logging side of things. With all of our footage pulled in, now it's a good time to go ahead and save our project. So let's go ahead and reset this. So save to save layout, great. And save it. And now I'm also gonna back it up. So I'm gonna hit save as, and then navigate to my project folder. And save. I now not only have the project that I'm working from, but also a backup of that project on my media RAID, just in case something happens. Remember, it's all about redundancy. Okay, so we've covered setting up our project, setting up our bins, pulling in media. All that's left is the project backup. Just to recap, because it's super important, back up the project every day when you're done editing. If you're rolling your eyes right now because you think that's too much work or it's too tedious, I will say that automated solutions do exist to help you here. But for better or worse, I prefer the hands-on approach so that I know that my projects are always safe and I know exactly where they're kept. All right, so coming up next in part 4, we're gonna get a handle on high-res footage using proxies.